It's November 1961. There's a meeting at the White House, and sitting around the table are the CIA director, the National Security Advisor, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and running the meeting is not the president, but the president's brother, Robert Kennedy, Attorney General of the United States. He's 36 years old. Now, Bobby Kennedy has one message for the room. Cuba is the top priority of the United States government. Everything else is secondary. No limit on time, there's no limit on money, effort, or manpower. He wants, and this is how a CIA officer who was there described it, he wants, quote, boom and bang all over the island.
Cuba, 90 miles south of Florida, population at that time about 7 million. A country that just 2 years earlier had overthrown the Batista dictatorship, an American-backed dictator.
Havana goes wild as the news spreads that Cuba's long struggle has ended with the flight of Batista and the triumph of Fidel Castro.
And the Cuban Revolution nationalized American property. By American property, I mean ruling class property, the sugar plantations, the oil refineries, the casinos.
The cry in Havana is, Cuba, see, Yankees, no. The trucks belong to the American-owned Cuban Electric Company, recently nationalized by the government, along with the telephone company, also American-owned. This is definitely a pro-Castro crowd enthusiastically defacing the telephone company building.
Cuba decide comprar petróleo soviético.
Cuba decided to buy oil from the Soviet Union, which would be cheaper, but the American companies refused to refine the oil.
Se niega a refinar ese petróleo.
With nowhere to refine the Soviet oil, Castro was faced with economic disaster. He sent in his militia and took over the foreign refineries in Cuba. Most important of all, Castro nationalized millions of acres of land held by American companies and gave it to the people.
And for that crime, I'm using air quotes, the full machinery of the most powerful state in human history was now aimed at its destruction. The program they authorized that day was called Operation Mongoose. It would become the largest covert operation ever directed at a single country during the Cold War. It included sabotage, terrorism, biological warfare plans, assassination plots, and at least 8 of those were confirmed by Congress.
Mongoose was, quote unquote, to get rid of Castro and the Castro regime. And when I asked my boss what does get rid of mean, all he said was, Sam, you can read the English language, you know what that means.
Over 600 assassination attempts, according to Cuban Intelligence. There was a secret CIA station set up in Miami, and it was so large that it was the biggest in the world outside of the Langley CIA headquarters. And it had its own fleet of boats and aircraft. It had 15,000 Cuban exiles on the payroll, and it had an annual budget of more than $500 million, that is in today's money.
And connected to Operation Mongoose, there was also a proposal from the Joint Chiefs of Staff called Operation Northwoods, which recommended staging terrorist attacks on American soil, bombing American cities, shooting down American civilian planes inside the United States, and blaming it all on Cuba to justify a full-scale invasion. This was not a conspiracy theory. It was a signed document from the highest-ranking military officers in the country. Kennedy ultimately rejected it, but the fact that it was proposed tells you everything about the mentality behind this policy.
We're covering this now because none of it is really history. The logic of Mongoose, that the United States has the right to destroy Cuba's economy, starve its people, engage in terrorist actions against the people on the island, and force, quote, regime change, close quote, that logic is operating right now, today, in 2026. The tools may have changed, the objective hasn't.
I'm Leanne Sima Fullahan, here with Brian Becker, and this is the Socialist Program. This is the second episode in our series on key moments in the history of U.S. imperialist intervention since the end of World War II, where we're taking deep dives into the Pentagon and CIA operations that shaped American foreign policy and its global strategy. Each of these operations was given a code name by the Pentagon, the CIA, and the White House, and those code names are how we're organizing this series. Today, we're focusing on two of the most brazen and chilling operations to ever come out of Washington, Operation Mongoose and Operation Northwoods. Both were directed at Cuba, and both reveal just how far the U.S. government was willing to go, not only to destroy the Cuban Revolution, but to manufacture the justification for doing it. We'll be talking about a covert campaign of sabotage, assassination, and terror, alongside a proposed false flag operation that would have staged attacks on American citizens and blamed them on Havana, all to provide a pretext for a full-scale invasion. These weren't the schemes of rogue actors. They were drawn up in the halls of power, approved at the highest levels of the U.S. national security state. That's what we're going to be unpacking today.
To understand why the United States launched this kind of war against Cuba, you have to understand what Cuba was before the revolution that took power in 1959, and what that revolution took away from the people who mattered, meaning the people in Washington, D.C. and on Wall Street. Before 1959, Cuba was, in practical terms, an American colony. Not formally, it had nominal independence, but the economic reality was total U.S. domination.
The island is far from free. All power is centered in Havana and in the hand of one man, Batista. In the provinces, however, the real master of Cuba is sugar. To the farmers, it matters little who rules in Havana. The crop is everything. If it is good, they live. If it is bad, they die.
The U.S. had invaded Cuba and Puerto Rico in 1898. The following year, the U.S. invaded the Philippines. Puerto Rico and the Philippines became U.S. colonies. Cuba, on the other hand, was declared to be a U.S. protectorate, that is, nominally independent, but under the full control of the United States. The pretext of the 1898 invasion of Cuba and Puerto Rico was to, quote, support the independence and sovereignty of those countries, close quote, which until then were colonies of Imperial Spain. But after the invasion, the United States refused to remove its troops from the island unless Cuba adopted the Platt Amendment as part of the new Cuban Constitution. The Platt Amendment was drafted by U.S. Secretary of War Elihu Root, and this amendment allowed the United States, formally, to intervene in Cuban affairs. It restricted Cuba's foreign policy and forced the lease of naval stations, including the one at Guantanamo Bay, to the United States. That's why the United States still occupies Guantanamo today, and it houses a massive U.S. military base right inside of Cuba. And of course, in that military base is a prison.
Guantanamo is a prison facility that was used by the United States after the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon as a place to imprison individuals who the CIA captured from places all around the world. A group of independent human rights experts appointed by the United Nations Human Rights Council described Guantanamo Bay as a, quote, site of unparalleled notoriety, defined by the systematic use of torture and other cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment against hundreds of men, close quote. They called it a stain on the U.S. government's commitment to the rule of law.
Every single detainee I met with lives with the unrelenting harms that follow from systematic practices of rendition, torture, and arbitrary detention.
Let's pick up the story after the U.S. invasion of Cuba back in 1898. From that time until the 1959 victory of the revolution, the U.S. capitalist establishment, not just the U.S. government, but the entire capitalist class in the United States, in essence, had the run of the place. They exercised control over all aspects of Cuban society. American corporations owned the sugar plantations, the mines, the utilities, the oil refineries, the telephone company.
Latin America supplies us with nearly 1/3 of all our imports, and among these are many of the raw materials with which we maintain our position as the world's industrial leader.
The mafia, with the active complicity of American intelligence services, ran the casinos, the hotels, the sex trade in Havana. Cuba was a playground for American money, for the rich, for the elite. Havana was where wealthy Americans went to do things that they, quote, couldn't do at home.
As I came into the beautiful harbor of Havana, my one thought was to land and go where all good Americans go when they go to Cuba. Can you guess where? Sloppy Joe's. The exclusive yacht club and the military club are in the background.
And all of this was protected in the 1950s by Fulgencio Batista, a dictator who ruled through torture, imprisonment, and murder.
Cuba's political freedom is ended as Batista cancels the June 1st elections. Batista says he is a friend of the people as his soldiers patrol the streets to establish what he calls disciplined democracy.
Tens of thousands of Cubans were killed or disappeared under the Batista regime. But the dictatorship protected American economic interests. So Washington, of course, backed Batista. That was the arrangement. That was always the arrangement.
And then Fidel Castro and the 26th of July movement overthrew Batista on January 1, 1959.
Havana, often the mecca for gamblers, sees the jackpot payoff of a political long shot. Bearing 26th of July banners, joyous followers of Fidel Castro sweep triumphantly through the Cuban capital hours after their rebellion had toppled the regime of Fulgencio Batista. The 26th of July refers to that day in 1953 when Castro began his long struggle to overthrow the dictator Batista with an abortive armed attack. With Batista in flight to the Dominican Republic, the celebrating soon turns to mob action and looting. Gambling machines get the axe. Other demonstrations at the University of Havana, where rebel leader Castro first gained prominence. He led student protests against the bloodless coup that brought Batista to power in 1952. American tourists who happen to be present when history is in the making seek refuge at the U.S. Embassy. They are taken safely to the airport and flown back home to safety in the USA. Castro follows a more leisurely itinerary to Havana. When he began this campaign with a handful of men, he said, "I will be a hero or a martyr." At 31, he's very much a hero.
It was an explosion of joy. The feelings of happiness and relief that finally we get rid of that regime. We got our national dignity, we got independence. For the first time, it was the people themselves that felt as being a protagonist of history. That was the most important week in our history.
And the new government then did something that U.S. foreign policy is fundamentally designed to prevent. The new government nationalized what had previously been considered by the U.S. as U.S. property. That means the sugar mills, the refineries, the utilities, the telephone companies, these were nationalized and reorganized to benefit the Cuban people. Land was redistributed, the plantations were redistributed, the casinos were shut down, the mafia was expelled, and in their place, the new government launched literacy campaigns, a program for universal health care, universal education. There was a complete restructuring of Cuban society along socialist lines. And here's the thing. This was not primarily an ideological problem for Washington. It was an economic problem. The mafia had lost its casinos, United Fruit had lost its sugar lands, Standard Oil had lost its refineries, powerful people with powerful friends in the government had lost a lot of money. So the ideological framing, the quote, communist threat or Soviet influence, was something that came after. The material interest here came first. Cuba's crime in the eyes of the United States was not that it was communist, or later as the US would accuse it to be, that it was authoritarian. It was Batista that was authoritarian, and the US loved Batista. Cuba's so-called crime was that it took what the US considered to be its property, even though it was on Cuban territory, and redistributed it to its own people.
Neither freedom without bread, nor bread without freedoms. Freedoms and bread.
The Eisenhower White House started planning to overthrow Castro almost immediately. In March 1960, Eisenhower authorized the CIA to start training and arming a paramilitary force of Cuban exiles for a future invasion that, combined with an extensive propaganda campaign, would aim to trigger an internal uprising to overthrow the Cuban government. The CIA recruited about 1,400 Cuban exiles, many of them from the Batista-era elite or its military forces. It trained them in Guatemala, and on April 17, 1961, just 3 months after JFK, John F. Kennedy, became president, the new White House sent those forces to invade Cuba at the Bay of Pigs.
In secret camps, the CIA was training Cuban exiles for an invasion of the island.
Eisenhower, the day before the inauguration, urged Kennedy to continue this policy.
Just a few months later, the invasion began. The landing at the Bay of Pigs was meant to be a surprise, but Castro knew it was coming.
Cuban intelligence knew that an invasion was coming, and that there were people being trained in camps in Guatemala and Nicaragua.
The CIA expected the Cubans to rise in support of their exile liberators. Instead, they fought back the invasion. Castro personally directed the defense of the island.
The invasion lasted less than 72 hours. It was a complete fiasco. Castro's military, with broad popular support, crushed it. 300 invaders were killed, 1,200 were captured. It was a profound humiliation for the Kennedy administration, which had inherited from the Eisenhower administration the plan for the invasion. But it was Kennedy who ultimately approved and took responsibility for the fiasco.
As I've said from the beginning, the operation was a failure, and that the responsibility rests with the White House.
Jack Kennedy was devastated by the fiasco at the Bay of Pigs, and he said it was a fiasco. He was not accustomed to failure in politics or in life. And he was more distraught than I'd ever seen him. How could I have been so stupid, he said.
So what was the Kennedy administration's takeaway from this fiasco at the Bay of Pigs? The takeaway was not that the U.S. should accept Cuba's revolution. It was that the methods to undermine it had failed.
This was the campground of the proud and optimistic Cuban Brigade, recruited, paid, trained, supplied by the CIA, and perhaps the largest covert operation in the history of subversion. What remains now is only the outdoor altar at which the Cubans prayed for victory. The CIA's Richard Bissell, author of the invasion plans, reflects on the lessons learned.
I think this is an unlearnable lesson. In any future operation of this kind, again, there is going to be an operator. His eyes are going to be fixed on the success of the operation. So far as he is concerned, it is going to be desirable to do things that, from the standpoint of others in the government, will involve major risks in a quite different dimension.
The goal destroying the Cuban government was not put into question. A review led by General Maxwell Taylor produced a line that became the operating premise going forward. He said, quote, "There can be no long-term living with Castro." The only question that the government then had was how to get rid of him.
The CIA was told to think again.
Our job was to start to come up with new plans, not a Bay of Pigs type plans, but new plans to, quote, get rid of Castro and the Castro regime, unquote.
And that's Operation Mongoose.
All right, here we are, Operation Mongoose. What was it, concretely? The scale of it, when people hear this, it's genuinely hard to believe.
So the decision-making body for Operation Mongoose was called the Special Group Augmented, and it was chaired by Bobby Kennedy. Its members included the CIA director, the National Security Advisor, the heads of the State Department, Defense Department, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. This wasn't a rogue operation. It was directed from the very top of the American government, and the Attorney General was personally running it with what everyone who was there described as an obsessive and relentless energy. The operational commander was Brigadier General Edward Lansdale. He was a counterinsurgency specialist. He was known as the guy who fought communist insurgents in the Philippines. He was the model for characters in the movie The Quiet American. He was a true believer in the U.S.'s ability to reshape other societies through violence, propaganda, and manipulation. And on the CIA side, William King Harvey ran Task Force W, the dedicated Mongoose unit. Hard-drinking, gun-carrying, Cold War operative who built the Berlin Tunnel and who was contemptuous of the Kennedy brothers, but he did do their bidding.
And where was this located? What was the headquarters? What was the operational base? This is where it gets staggering. It was something called JM/Wave, a massive secret CIA station built on the campus of the University of Miami, inside a former Naval Air Station. Under Ted Shackley, JM/Wave became the largest CIA station on Earth, that is, outside of the Langley CIA headquarters in Virginia. At that headquarters, there were 300 to 400 professional CIA operatives. Again, this is all on the campus of the University of Miami. 15,000 Cuban exiles were on the payroll. 300 to 400 front companies across all of South Florida. There was a cover corporation called Zenith Technical Enterprises. The operation had a fleet of aircraft and boats that constituted the third largest naval force in the entire Caribbean, behind only the U.S. Navy and Cuba's own Navy. The annual budget for the operation at the University of Miami was around $50 million, $1962. Adjusted for inflation over time, that would be the equivalent, as we said earlier, of over $500 million, more than $500 million. The CIA was one of Miami's largest employers. It created an economic boom in South Florida real estate, banking, and manufacturing. Think about what this means. The United States built a secret military intelligence infrastructure in the city of Miami, an entire parallel economy dedicated to the destruction of a sovereign country 90 miles away. And the people profiting from the infrastructure, the contractors, the front companies, the real estate developers, the exile community leaders getting CIA checks, they all had a material interest in the conflict with Cuba continuing. The anti-Castro industry, and it became an industry, generated its own momentum and its own money.
So in February of 1962, Lansdale presented the plan. The plan had 6 phases that would run through October and culminate in what he called a, quote, touchdown play, which would be an open revolt against Castro backed by a U.S. military force. The plan involved 32 specific tasks across multiple agencies. Half would be assigned to the CIA and would involve things like intelligence gathering, political warfare, propaganda, economic sabotage, military sabotage, and assassination. The sabotage operations would mean that CIA agents and their exile proxies would raid Cuban ports, raid refineries, raid industrial facilities, that they would have to plant explosives, set fires, contaminate sugar exports. And there's one detail that really doesn't get enough attention in the telling of this history. A Defense Department status report referenced plans for incapacitating large sections of the sugar workers by the covert use of biological or chemical warfare agents. This means that the CIA was getting ready to use biological weapons against agricultural workers in Cuba. And let's remember that the sugar harvest was the backbone of Cuba's economy. The US government was basically planning to poison the workforce that sustained it.
And then there were the assassination plots, which are, honestly, if you wrote this as a fiction, nobody would believe it. The 1975 Church Committee, that was a reform committee, a committee to reform the CIA in the 1970s when some of the CIA's crimes came to light, confirmed at least 8 separate CIA plots to kill Fidel Castro between 1960 and 1965.
Today, the Senate CIA investigators heard testimony from underworld figure John Roselli.
For 2.5 hours, he told of plotting with the CIA starting in 1960 to try to kill Castro, by poison, by rifle, trying to land hit teams by powerboat.
Cuba's counterintelligence chief, Fabian Escalante, estimated a different number. The Cubans said that there were 634 total schemes, that would be assassination plots, over the decades. The methods ranged from deadly serious to genuinely deranged. The serious ones first. Here they are. The CIA recruited the American Mafia, Johnny Roselli, Sam Giancana out of Chicago, Santos Traficante, who'd run the Havana operation. The logic being the mob had networks, already existing networks in Cuba, and for their own reasons, wanted Fidel dead. He had, after all, shut down their casinos and their brothels. The CIA offered Roselli $150,000. They provided botulinum toxin capsules to be slipped into Castro's food.
Disclosing he'd been on the CIA's payroll since 1954, Mayo said he was asked by his project officer to contact mafia figure John Roselli to help in Castro's removal.
My only understanding was that the capsules were to be given to someone, and the someone I didn't know then and never have known since, who was in a position to be close enough to Castro so that it could be administered if need be.
On one attempt, the pills fell apart in the freezer. On another, the operative just didn't get close enough.
Then there's the absurd assassination attempts. The CIA's Technical Services Division, the same unit that ran MK-Ultra, developed cigars laced with botulinum toxin so concentrated that just putting one in your mouth would kill you. They had a plan to dust Fidel's shoes with thallium salts to make his beard fall out and supposedly destroy his image. They had another plan to spray his broadcast studio with an LSD-like compound so that he'd lose his mind on television. They developed had a plan for an explosive seashell to be planted where he went scuba diving. They developed a contaminated diving suit coated with a skin-destroying fungus, a breathing apparatus infected with tuberculosis. You can get the picture here.
And the Kennedy White House was driving this. For decades, the story was the assassination plots were just rogue CIA officers, that Kennedy did not know the truth. The declassified record says otherwise. CIA Director Richard Helms told the Church Committee, again, that's in the 1970s, that the Kennedy administration officials put, quote, heavy pressure, close quote, on the agency to get rid of Castro.
Castro is only the beginning of our difficulty throughout Latin America. The big struggle will be to prevent the influence of Castro spreading to other countries.
Bobby Kennedy was personally obsessive on this topic. He berated CIA officials for not being aggressive enough. He told one meeting Cuba was the top priority in the government, all else is secondary. The mechanism was plausible deniability. Remember that term, plausible deniability. That is a euphemism in communications, meaning eliminating Castro, removing him without specifying how. Everyone would understand what was being asked. The president could deny knowing the details, but the intent was never in question.
The Kennedys hoped for what we now call a regime change in Cuba. And there is an ambiguity about the word removal. Remove Castro from power or remove him from life.
And here's where it gets genuinely dark, and even darker than these assassination plots against the leader of another country, which is already dark enough. In March of 1962, the Joint Chiefs of Staff under Chairman General Lyman Lemnitzer presented a proposal to Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara called Operation Northwoods. This was a signed document from the highest-ranking military officers in the United States recommending false flag attacks, which would be operations staged by the U.S. government but blamed on Cuba to create a pretext for a full-scale invasion. And these are some of the proposals in that document, or in that plan. To stage a fake attack on the U.S. naval base at Guantanamo Bay, to sink an American ship in the harbor and blame Cuba, to launch what the document called a, quote, communist Cuban terror campaign in Miami and Washington. It also proposed bombings in American cities carried out by the U.S. government, or the hijacking of civilian aircraft. It also proposed sabotaging a space launch at Cape Canaveral and blaming Cuban agents.
And the documents explicitly discussed American civilian casualties as a tool for generating public support for a war against Cuba. This wasn't hypothetical. This wasn't some analyst's thought experiment. This was a formal proposal from the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the Pentagon to the U.S. Secretary of Defense. Kennedy ultimately rejected the plan. Lemnitzer was removed as chairman, but nobody was prosecuted. Nobody was publicly exposed. The document, in fact, wasn't declassified until the late 1990s. And the fact that it existed, that the top military brass in the United States was prepared to murder American citizens to justify invading a small Caribbean island, tells you something important about the nature of the state. This is what the national security apparatus is willing to do when it decides something is a priority. The constraints are not, obviously, moral ones. They're political. Kennedy did not reject Northwoods because it was monstrous. He rejected it because it was too risky.
And you have to put Northwoods in context. This is the same government, the same year that was running Operation Mongoose, which included sabotage, biological warfare plans, and assassination. This is the same government that just a year earlier had invaded Cuba at the Bay of Pigs. It was the same government whose own State Department had written in 1960 that the goal was to bring about, quote, hunger, desperation, and the overthrow of government through economic warfare. Northwoods was not an aberration. It was the logical next step of a policy that had already crossed every other line.
There's also a connection that almost never gets made in the standard telling of what is called the Cuban Missile Crisis. That would have taken place in October 1962. The connection I'm talking about is to everything we have just described. The American version of the Cuban Missile Crisis goes like this. In October 1962, the Soviets put nuclear missiles in Cuba as an act of unprovoked aggression. In response, Kennedy stood firm. Ultimately, the Soviets blinked, they backed down. America won this confrontation. That's the end of the story.
Except that version erases the entire preceding year. We have to remember that for 12 months before those missiles showed up, the United States had been running the largest covert operation in Cold War history against Cuba, with all the sabotage raids, assassination plots, and biological warfare plans against agricultural workers that we've just described, with the secret military infrastructure in Miami, and the explicit plan that Lansdale had called for an uprising, an October uprising backed by a U.S. military force in October 1962. That's the very month that the Cuban Missile Crisis, the so-called Cuban Missile Crisis, had erupted.
And that October uprising was again part of Operation Mongoose. So here you have Operation Mongoose, the proposed Project Northwoods, all underway as a top priority of the U.S. government before October 1962, before what became known in history as the Cuban Missile Crisis.
The Cold War was, in a real sense, a hot war for the 7 years I was secretary. It was 24 hours a day.
Kennedy and his advisors were obsessed with Cuba.
In the spring of 1962, a practice invasion of a Caribbean island was mounted by 40,000 American Marines.
We did that purposely to make Castro pay more attention to that than causing trouble in Latin and Central America.
So obviously Cuba knew it was under attack, and Cuba made a choice. Soviet missiles weren't simply placed on the island. They were accepted. They were accepted by the government in Cuba led by Fidel. And in part, it was an act of socialist solidarity with the Soviet Union that found itself staring down American nuclear weapons in Turkey and Italy. The U.S. was, in fact, encircling the Soviet Union with nuclear missiles. Cuba's decision to accept Soviet missiles indicated that this was a two-way relationship between sovereign states, Cuba and the Soviet Union, that had, of course, a certain ideological identity and a certain solidarity, but they had overlapping national interests as well. This was not a case of a small country being used simply as a chess piece by a major power.
Fidel Castro.
I immediately appreciated the strategic importance of the presence of those missiles in Cuba. By that time, the Americans had already transported similar missiles to Turkey. I thought, if we expected the Soviets to fight on our behalf, to run risks for us, and even involve themselves in a war for our sake, it would be immoral and cowardly on our part to refuse to accept the presence of those missiles here.
The Cuban Missile Crisis was truly an existential moment for all of humanity. When an American U-2 spy plane flying over Cuba successfully photographed the construction of the missile sites inside of Cuba, the United States immediately demanded that the Soviet Union remove all of the missiles. At first, the Cuban government refused. Then, Kennedy, on October 22nd of 1962, delivered a public ultimatum in a televised address, demanding that the Soviets dismantle and remove missiles from Cuba, and announcing a naval quarantine, or another word for that would be blockade, and warning that any nuclear missile launched from Cuba would be treated as a Soviet attack on the United States, requiring a full retaliation.
We will not prematurely or unnecessarily risk the course of worldwide nuclear war, in which even the fruits of victory would be ashes in our mouth. But neither will we shrink from that risk at any time it must be faced.
This particular blockade, it was a naval blockade, literally a blockade using U.S. naval warships that were all over the Caribbean and the Atlantic, designed to intercept Soviet vessels bringing equipment and supplies to Cuba. We want to make a distinction because there is a long-standing economic blockade of Cuba. This was a literal naval blockade of the island. Part of the shipments that were coming on Soviet vessels were to finish the job of the installation of nuclear missiles. The U.S. knew this. At first, it appeared that the Soviets were going to go forward with the shipment of this equipment, no matter what. And then Kennedy made his public ultimatum on TV, national television. Everybody was watching it. People all over the world watched it. And at the last moment, under that pressure, the Soviet government, led by Khrushchev, decided to back down. They blinked. They said, we agree to remove the missiles from Cuba. Now, that's what the American people heard. There was a greater part to the resolution of this crisis. It wasn't simply that which the Kennedy administration announced, meaning that the U.S. had forced the Soviets' hand, the Soviets backed down, end of question. In fact, there were other parts of the agreement, some of them made behind the scenes.
So the actual back-channel resolution to this crisis involved two key elements. One, that the Soviet Union would remove the nuclear missiles from Cuba, but that would be done in exchange for a U.S. pledge to not invade Cuba.
Hello?
Yes, please.
Oh, it's the general on there.
I'll put it on here, sir. Ready?
Hello? General, how are you? Oh, fine. General, I just wanted to bring you up to date on this matter because I know of your concern about it. We got, Friday night, got a message from Khrushchev, which said that he would withdraw these missiles and technicians and so on, providing we did not plan to invade Cuba.
And the second element was a secret agreement that was not revealed publicly for decades after, that the U.S. would remove its nuclear missiles, Jupiter missiles, from Turkey within several months of the agreement. Interestingly, there was a lot of tension between different elements of the Pentagon and the Kennedy administration, Kennedy himself. The Joint Chiefs, led by Curtis LeMay, were actually pushing hard for airstrikes and a full invasion of Cuba. So they weren't happy with this resolution.
We talked about the possibility of an airstrike, which was at one time or another almost everybody's first choice upon first thought, to knock out the missiles. We talked about an invasion of Cuba, which was always the preferred choice of the right wing, go in and take Cuba away from Castro and rid the island of communism while at the same time getting rid of these missiles. A diplomatic approach, either bilaterally or through the United Nations. A blockade or quarantine, as it later came to be called. No decision was made at that first meeting, but if a vote had been taken there, airstrike was probably number one on everybody's list.
We had a huge invasion force, a huge invasion plan. The first day's airstrikes were to, I think, be 1,080 sorties. We had 180,000 troops mobilized, ready to invade Cuba. The chiefs recommended at 4:30 p.m. on Saturday, October 27th, that we initiate the air attack within about a day and a half.
While President Kennedy calls for restraint, Air Force General Curtis LeMay pushes back, and the sharp exchange is caught on tape.
That a blockade and political talk would be considered by a lot of our friends and neutrals as being a pretty weak response to this. I'm sure a lot of our own citizens would feel that way too. In other words, you're in a pretty bad fix at the present time. You're in a pretty bad fix.
Yes, Curtis LeMay was a madman. He was a lunatic. He was in charge of the carpet bombing of Vietnam a few years later. He wanted to escalate the war in Vietnam. He wanted to use nuclear weapons to destroy all of Vietnam. LeMay became famous / notorious by all of the crimes committed by the United States a few years later in Vietnam. And the U.S. anti-war movement focused on LeMay as a real criminal. But it's important to remember LeMay himself was not a rogue actor. He was a seriously important military figure in the Pentagon and in the U.S. military establishment.
LeMay famously called Kennedy's blockade and negotiate approach appeasement. The military wanted military action, not diplomacy. So the tension during the crisis was actually partly between Kennedy and his own military brass, who thought he was being too soft. The Pentagon was demanding a war that would have quickly become a nuclear war.
I walked out of the President's Oval Office, and as I walked out, I thought I might never live to see another Saturday night.
I think it's also important to mention timing here. The Pentagon and Kennedy were basically at war in October 1962. The Kennedy administration was seeking a diplomatic resolution, and the Pentagon generals, including this lunatic, Curtis LeMay, were prepared for all-out thermonuclear war with the Soviet Union. They believed that war with the Soviet Union was inevitable, and that eventually the Soviet Union would become stronger, that if they fought the Soviets then in 1962, that even though 30 or 40 or 50 million Americans would die, the U.S. would win the nuclear war, the Soviet Union would be defeated, communism would be defeated. And Kennedy came out of those meetings and said, famously, the military is mad. Well, he's talking about Curtis LeMay and people like him. 1 year later, Kennedy is assassinated in Dallas.
And let's just remember that if the Soviets had not agreed to the resolution, if the Soviets hadn't blinked, if they had not retreated in this moment and this resolution was not reached, that the Pentagon would have initiated a thermonuclear war. And that's how close we came to the end of life on the planet, at least the end of life as we know it.
So the crisis is resolved with a public Soviet commitment to remove the missiles in exchange for a U.S. pledge not to invade Cuba, plus a secret deal to pull American Jupiter missiles out of Turkey. But even after the resolution, even after Kennedy gave Khrushchev assurances, the covert operations against Cuba, against the Cuban Revolution, against the Fidel-led government, all of that continued.
It may be only one more chapter in a rather long story as far as Cuba is concerned.
Of course.
On November 8th, 1962, a CIA dispatch team blew up a Cuban industrial facility, a factory. The promise not to invade Cuba apparently did not extend to not bombing Cuba.
Operation Mongoose was formally disbanded that November 1962. But the infrastructure, so JM/WAVE, the operational base, the networks of Cuban exiles, the policy of hostility and aggression continued. Anti-Castro operations went on throughout the 60s under new code names, and the assassination plots continued until at least 1965. And the blockade, the enduring blockade, the economic blockade that was imposed formally in 1962 has never been lifted, not once in 64 years.
This is the piece that ties the whole story together. Because what happened is that Mongoose technically ended, as you mentioned, in November 1962. But the economic warfare component didn't just survive. It became a very dominant part of the entire strategy. But not alone. Many covert operations also continued against Cuba. Thousands of Cubans died during the 1960s as a consequence of U.S. CIA-sponsored terror attacks on the island. The assassination plots may have faded and the sabotage raids may have wound down somewhat, but the economic strangulation of Cuba and its entire economy actually intensified. It did not diminish over the decades.
Well, Brian, I think that we've come to the end of our episode. This has been the second episode of our series on Pentagon and CIA operations and how they have shaped U.S. foreign policy. Next time, we'll be looking at another operation that reveals how the United States uses its covert power to attempt to reshape the world. Until then, we want to say thank you to all of our patrons for keeping the show on the air, and a special thank you to our dear friend John Preisner, whose audio engineering skills makes this show what it is.